Understanding those three file types, let's look inside of Eclipse and see how we interact with each one. So I'm here inside the project we just created. I've got my Package Explorer down here on the left, which is basically the same as the Visual Studio Solution Explorer. And basically we have our SRC folder, right? That's our source code folder. You'll notice I expand that, and you see I got com.pluralsight.demoapp. And the first thing you may be wondering is that I explained a second ago that it's actually hierarchical in terms of com being under source, Pluralsight being under com, and then demoapp being under Pluralsight. That actually is the case on the file system. What's happening here is Eclipse is looking at each of these folders, and it understands the file structure. And since com and Pluralsight have no actual source code files in there, it's just rolling them up for convenience so that we can navigate through here much more easily as opposed to having to click through a bunch of empty folder structures. Now inside there, of course, is our actual source code file, our main activity. Remember that when we went through the wizard, we named our main activity, in other words, our primary user interface form, main activity. If I double click on that, that takes me into my source code view. And we just have some methods stubbed out here for us. We'll talk a lot about these later in the series, but this onCreate is called initially when our activity is created. OnCreate option menu is how a menu initially gets created. If you look over here in the Package Explorer, you see if I expand this, I can see the methods. Now with only two methods here, this isn't that helpful, but if I had more methods, I could just double click on any method name and just jump directly to it. Now, something to keep in mind is that, remember, when we went through the wizard, we named the activity. I talked about the class, but then we also had activity underscore main, which was our layout resource. Right? That's the first one of the resources that we interact with. You'll notice there's also another resource down here for the menu called main. So we see the resources are being very explicitly used inside of our source code here. So if I go back over to the Package Explorer, you notice here I've got my resource folder. And we talked about the different types that are here, right? So the one we were looking at just now, of course, was the activity main. Right? So if I double click on that, you see what happens is that you get a nice little GUI UI comes up, right? This allows us to construct our UI in a way very consistent with the way Visual Studio works, is that we have our various controls, we can drag them onto here. If we select a control, the properties for that control open up over here that we can set. But the thing that's interesting to understand is that all of this really is just front-ending an XML file. It's just a GUI over an XML file. So we're on this graphical layout tab. What we're actually working on here is this XML file here. So if I select that tab, this is what we're creating. And we could of course manually type that up and build this. In fact, for a long time, that's actually how we did it in Android. The GUI added to Eclipse was actually a relatively late addition to the Eclipse capability. But obviously it was a key part of making Android much more accessible. So we have these XML files in here, and if you want to do something that kind of goes beyond what the GUI can do, you can always go into here. But over time, the Eclipse GUI UI over top of the XML file has gotten quite good. Now we also have other things in here. We talked about the menu. If I look at here, if I double click on the menu, right, this is taking me into the XML file for it. So this actually has a menu with an item on it. But there's also a layout view here, so I can graphically build a menu. So this lets me build individual menu items, right? Set the properties on those. I can build hierarchical menus through here. Right? Again, we'll talk about these details in one of the other courses where we talk about actually building UIs. There's other things in here too, like resources for externalizing values, right? So I can take my string values. And so under here, this values folder. If I double click on strings, you can see I have the strings laid out as XML here, right, with a name and a value, a name and a value. But even those have a graphical layout, so I can just create new resource items, identify their type as a string or an integer, and then give those names and values. So I can do all that as well. Now, as we talked about, they're the ones that rely on the XML files, right? The other resource types we talked about use actual file types, like for graphics. So like if I have my icon here, right, the IC launcher, if I double click on that, that will actually open up the PNG file that I'm using for the icon. Right, so I'd have to use an appropriate editor if I wanted to change that. You'll notice though that we have like a drawable HDPI, but there's a whole bunch of other drawables here too, LDPI, MDPI, all the way up to XXHDPI. One of the things we'll talk about later on in this series is the automatic adaptability of device differences that Android supports. What happens is that all drawable resources go into a drawable named folder like this, but then a hyphen and an extension on the end says that I want this to adapt to certain device differences. So this is the icon I use for a high density UI. But if I want to go up to the extremely high density here at the XXDPI, you notice that I've got another file of the same name underneath of this folder. Right? I double click on it. That's actually what appears to be a larger PNG file, right? Because it's a higher resolution file. In fact, to prove that, if I click on the properties on this first one here and I go to properties, you see its size is about 3,800 bytes. If I go down here, I right click properties on this one, you see the size of that guy is about over 8,000 bytes, right? It's a higher resolution file. So one of the things that Android will do at runtime is when it goes to load a drawable resource, it'll look at the particular display for that device and it'll load the appropriate one of these based on the folder name. And it does that in a lot of different ways in resources. And again, we'll talk about the details later, but you'll notice that even things like values. Well, here for our values, we have a bunch of default values. But then we have the values we want to use for version 11 of the SDK and different values we define for version 14 of the SDK. So Android will go ahead and just take care of making those adjustments for us automatically. Again, we'll talk about the details on that a little bit later. Now, one last thing we want to look at here is our manifest file. So I'm going to just double click on that. And the manifest file, as I mentioned, is how your application advertises to the platform and also to some degree to the Google Play Store what your application is capable of, what it supports. We'll talk about this SDKs it supports, naming information, all kinds of stuff in there. And again, it's an XML file, and it can be a fairly sophisticated XML file if your application has a lot going on. So this also has GUI UIs for it. But the manifest has a number of different sections to it. So rather than there being just one GUI for it, there are different GUIs for each section. Right, so this is the XML view. If we go to the manifest tab, this will edit items that relate to the manifest section itself. Right, so if I click on that, you see things like the package name. Remember, we identified that when we first created the app. Right? That's our unique identifier throughout the Google Play universe. Right? Our version code and our version names, these are tracking the actual versions of our application. Right? There's a uses SDK here. Right? This identifies what versions of Android this application supports, down to version 8 all the way up through 17. You also may wonder, looking at these, going, well, there's no Android version 8. Right? We're up to, at the time I'm recording this, we're up to 4.2, 4.3 is about to come out. This has to do with SDK numbers. We're going to talk about that in the very next module, about how Android versions and SDK numbers tie back and forth to each other. But the key thing here is just notice that we're able to control that here. We have other things, the application-specific information inside of here. So we talk about what label we want to use, what icon we want to use. And you notice that inside of here, this is even with these @ symbols, identify that this value comes from another resource. So we're saying that the icon that we want to use comes from the drawable resource. Its name is IC Launcher. Right? The label we want to put on the application comes from a string resource, right, in our strings, with the name app name, and so forth. So you see the manifest can actually reference things inside the resource files. Another thing that's interesting inside of here is the permissions. Right? Now, permissions is a really important one because it relates to what your application is allowed to do. Right? So if I go in here and I say add and say I want to do a uses permission, so I'll double click on that, and that adds a uses permission item inside of here. This identifies what kind of permissions I want to use. Right? This relates to when you go to install an Android application, a screen pops up and says, hey, these are the permissions this application needs. Do you want to go ahead and allow those to work, allow those to be used? So it does one thing, which is actually prompts the user to say, hey, here's what it's going to try to do. But it also is used by the Android operating system that you can't access anything for which you haven't requested permissions for. Right? In other words, many features of the operating system are protected. They require security privileges. So you must explicitly declare which of those privileges you wish to use so the user can opt in for them. And then the operating system will enforce that you can only access those things for which you've requested permission for. Right? So for an example here, if I just click this drop down, can scroll down here and let's go down to something like I want to have my application access the internet. Right? So if I scroll down here, there's an internet privilege. So I can say I want to allow my application to access the internet. Right? So you see the manifest is this really important piece that just identifies a whole bunch of aspects of our system. As we talk more about building our applications, we'll work through the individual sections inside the manifest to understand how they each apply. Right, the key thing to remember, though, is that every application must have a manifest. It must be named Android manifest.xml, and both the operating system and Google Play are going to use that to understand what your application is doing and what it supports.